Hello, BookTube. This is Aaron from Aaron Read a Book or Aaron Read a Book. Um, I've got a Friday Reads update for you. I didn't do one last week because I was sort of in the middle of books, but finished three books since I last done one, and I'm reading another book at the moment, so we'll talk about those. Um, the first book I read is sort of for BookTube at War, but I don't know if it really counts because it's really a sci-fi, and that is The Guns of the South by Harry Turtledove. Um, and I'll put the cover up here, but as you can see from the cover, it's Robert E. Lee with an AK-47. So it's an alternative history basically. Um, so this was written in the early 90s, and it's about some South African white supremacists who go back in time to the Civil War, and it's after Gettysburg, so it's quite late in the Civil War, and the South are losing, and they supply the South with AK-47s basically, um, and it's told from the perspective of Southerners. So it's the two main characters are Robert E. Lee and um, a guy called Nate Caudle, who's just I can't remember his exact rank, but he's sort of a sergeant, maybe a sergeant in the 47th, I think it is. And he's a real. I didn't realize this till after I'd read the book, but in the end, he tells you that um, everyone in this book is a real person. Obviously, they didn't have AK-47s, but and he, obviously Robert E. Lee is more probably realistic than Nate, and all the characters in there, uh, in the army are just probably names and occupations. But he was a real person, and another person in the book who is one of the main characters is a girl called Molly who dressed up as a man and enlisted in the army and called himself Marvin, and that's a real person as well, which was really interesting. Um, but basically, this is probably not a spoiler because of the nature of the book, but the South win the Civil War in this because they've got the superior guns, um, and it's doesn't shy away from the issue of slavery at all. This whole book is basically about slavery, and the two Southerners that it follows are both quite sympathetic characters, and they are made more sympathetic by how horrible the South African racist guys are, the white supremacists. They're sort of disgusted by them, and um, they're also impressed by how the black soldiers uh, fight, um, and a lot of it's incredibly well researched. Harry Turtledove writes non-fiction as well, and has a PhD in history and stuff. Um, and it sort of brings up the question of if the South had won, the problem of slavery does not go away. It in fact becomes worse because once the states are split in two, the North obviously abolishes as abolished slavery. So it makes it makes it even harder uh, to keep slaves in the South. And yeah, it's I don't want to go into any more spoilers, but yeah, it was very interesting and incredibly well done alternative history. Um, I don't know a huge amount about the Civil War, um, but you could tell it was incredibly well researched. Yeah, it was really good. I'll give it 4 stars. Then the next book I read was a reread, and it's for Jane Austen July, and that was Pride and Prejudice. I didn't actually read this because I find these cloth bound classics rub. I think if you handle them too much, these bits rub off. So I never actually read my cloth bound classics I always just read it an ebook copy. Yeah, so I'm going through all the Jane Austen books a second time at the moment, or each Jane Austen July I read another one. Um, I feel like I know every single part of this off by heart already because I've watched sort of so many adaptations of it as well as reading this being the second reading. Um, so I won't really do a proper review of it because everyone's read it and or at least knows the story. Um, just some things that um, popped out at me this time is how clever the structure of it is. Like it's almost written like an Agatha Christie or a mystery novel. Um, and I love the bit like uh, where Lizzie first rejects Mr. Darcy and then he gives her the letter. And as she's reading the letter, and as you're reading the letter, sort of bits of Wickham's um, behaviour start falling into place, like a mystery when you discover who the killer is. um, yeah, so well done. And Jane Austen's incredible at doing letters in books. Like it's not as good as Persuasion, but it's a great letter. Um, I also really love the bit where she first goes to Pemberley after that as well, and she talks to the housekeeper, and that again starts to reveal things about Darcy's character that were sort of not so obvious before. Um, and just I love every bit with Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, like especially Mr. Bennet, especially tickle me this time. I love how he's always like he was not my favourite son-in-law. That's still Wickham, and and just how much he loves Mr. Collins's letters as well. He's like, yeah, he's my favourite correspondent. But yeah, it's just a book full of joy and hilarity as well as being just an incredible romance. The structure of this novel is obviously been recreated a million times. But yeah, there's a reason why it's a classic. um, the next book I read was uh, by one of my favourite science fiction writers, one of my favourite British science fiction writers anyway, and that is John Wyndham's Chocky. And it's one of the last novels of his that I haven't read. It was the last novel he wrote. Um, and um, Brian Aldiss famously said that called his books cozy catastrophes because they're very sort of middle class. Um, and I think he sort of said it in a way to say like that there's no sort of they're not dark at all. They're very light, and there's uh, no sort of deeper side to them. But I disagree with that generally. This one I think is probably his coziest catastrophe because um, a bit like the Midwich Cuckoos, it takes place inside a child. So um, in the Midwich Cuckoos, um, the town goes dark, and when they all wake up, they all fall asleep, and when they all wake up, all the women are pregnant. Um, um, but in Chocky, it's just about one child, and this child has an imaginary friend who is obviously extraterrestrial. Although it's obvious to us because he's talking about mathematics and things, and they have different style of mathematics, and he laughs at their technology and things. Um, but yeah, it's cozy in that the 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 alien Chocky is a force of good, not a force of evil, and is more like a sort of emissary. Um, and the all the negative and dangerous things in this novel are from humanity. So the the way there's I won't go into any plot points, but there's things that happen, and it's the human reactions which are the danger. There's parts where people where the child gets into the media for it doing extraordinary things because Chocky's done them. Um, and they're sort of harassed by the media and stuff. And this was written in the 60s, so uh, it not as bad as it is now. But yeah, that was very interesting. Um, and some of the scientists in it, or the psychologists, uh, seem to have ulterior motives and stuff. Um, but the interesting thing about this, maybe it's because it was late in his career, and he died soon after. But it's quite a lot. Although I think he died reasonably young. It's quite a lot about how to treat children who are different in some way, and it's really interesting in that it's quite a lot about how, yeah, like how worried they are about the child, and and how best to treat him without sort of traumatizing him. Um, but yeah, it was really good. I think it's better than um, the Trouble with Lycan. I think it's probably about equal the Day of the Triffids, but my favourite my favourite two Wyndhams are still the Chrysalids and um, the Midwich Cookies, which both of which are really good. Lots of creepy children in his books. So if you like creepy children books, although this is not creepy, but yeah, that's really good. And and yeah, so I finished that, and then um, thinking of that famous Brian Aldiss quote, I started reading a Brian Aldiss because I've only read one of his, which was Non-Stop, which is a really cool generational ship book. So if you like generation ship books, Non-Stop's definitely an interesting one. But this time I'm reading Greybeard, which is another really interesting concept, and it's sort of the same as Children of Men, in that the world, some catastrophe have hit the world, and people can't have children anymore. And in fact, most animals can't have children anymore either. It's obviously some sort of nuclear thing, but it doesn't go into detail. Um, and yeah, but unlike Children of Men, this was written way before Children of Men, so Children of Men must have been influenced by it. But unlike Children of Men, it's not a recent occurrence. It's like quite far into the future. So the titular character Greybeard is actually like really young. He's like the youngest generation left. He's in his mid 50s. Um, so he sort of talks about how he'll always be the youngest generation because there's no generation after him. And it's been really interesting so far. I'll do a full review next time. But yeah, how have you been getting on BookTube? What have you been reading? Let me know in the comments if you read any of these, or if you like John Wyndham, or what you've been reading for Jane Austen July. Have a good one, BookTube.